adrenal gland. They are a pair of yellowish, flat, pyramid-like glands, which lie over the upper end of the kidneys. They look like a cap on the kidney. Each gland has an outer yellow adrenal cortex, an inner reddish brown adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla secretes two hormones called adrenaline or epinephrine and non-adrenaline or non-epinephrine. These are commonly called catecholamines. In conditions of physical and mental stress, such as fall in blood sugar levels, or when a person is injured or exposed to cold conditions or suffering with pain, it is also secreted during anger, fear, or grief. It helps the body to face these conditions. It is therefore called fight, fright, and flight. These hormones increase alertness, pupillary dilation, raising of hairs, sweating, etc. The hormone increases blood supply to heart and skeletal muscles. It constricts arterioles and blood supply to skin and gastrointestinal tract. The bronchioles dilate. There is increased rate of breathing, oxygenation, and heartbeat to meet any emergency. Catecholamines stimulate the breakdown of glycogen, resulting in increased concentration of glucose in blood. They also stimulate the breakdown of lipids and proteins. Adrenal cortex can be divided into three layers called zona reticularis, inner layer, zona fasciculata, middle layer, zona glomerulosa, outer layer. Adrenal cortex secretes many hormones called corticoids. A. Glucocorticoids involved in carbohydrate metabolism. Example, cortisol. B. Mineralocorticoids. Corticoids which regulate the balance of water and electrolytes in our body. Example, aldosterone. Glucocorticoids stimulate gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, and proteolysis and inhibit cellular uptake and utilization of amino acids. Cortisol is also involved in maintaining the cardiovascular system and kidney functions. It also produces anti-inflammatory reactions and suppresses the immune response. Cortisol stimulates RBC production. Aldosterone acts at renal tubules and stimulates reabsorption of Na+ and water excretion of K+ and PO4-. Thus, aldosterone helps in the maintenance of electrolytes, body fluid volume, osmotic pressure, and BP. Small amount of androgenic steroids are also secreted by adrenal cortex, which play a role in the growth of axial hair, pubic hair, and facial hair during puberty.
Okay, we're now going to talk about the adrenal gland and answer the what questions. What is the topography, parts, vascular supply, and histology of the adrenal gland? What hormones are secreted by the adrenal cortex and medulla? And what is the stimulation, function, and inhibition of adrenal hormones? Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Morton, and I'm the noted anatomist. Okay, so the adrenal gland is located on top of the kidney. So there's the right kidney and the left kidney. On top, there's the right adrenal gland and the left adrenal gland. Now, adrenal means on top of or beside the kidney, and so that's why it's called the gland beside or on top of the kidney. But it's also on top of, so suprarenal gland is another term that is used. Now, the adrenal gland is retroperitoneal. Now, what does that mean? Well, here we have an axial section through the abdomen as viewed from foot to head, like an axial CT. So the liver is in the upper right, and the stomach is in the upper left, and spleen is the upper left of this section. And there in orange is our parietal peritoneum, the mesothelium lining the wall, and the visceral peritoneum, the mesothelium lining the organs. And in between the two is this space, the peritoneal cavity, filled with peritoneal fluid. Now, I mention this because all of that, peritoneal, parietal peritoneum, visceral peritoneum, the organs they surround, this is called intraperitoneal, which means that everything behind that is retroperitoneal. Now, this prefix retro means in the past or backward. Like in the past, like in a retro movie or TV series like Stranger Things takes place in the mid-1980s. Okay, that's when I was in high school, and all the fashions and the music and the whole bit go with that. So retroperitoneal are organs in the past, organs backwards or behind the peritoneum. This includes our right and left kidneys. They're classic retroperitoneal organs in the ureters, but as well as these things, the adrenal glands. There's the right adrenal and the left adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland has a cortex and a medulla. So the adrenal cortex is the outer portion. So if we now take and blow up this adrenal gland, there's the adrenal cortex. It's the outside and has these three parts to it, the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Those are the three different areas or regions of the adrenal cortex. Now, the inner portion is called the adrenal medulla. So what is the vascular supply? Well, the arteries that supply the adrenal gland are through suprarenal arteries. There's three of them. So there's the aorta, and coming off the aorta is this inferior phrenic artery. Phrenic dealing with the diaphragm because it supplies the diaphragm. But look, it's got all these little superior suprarenal arteries that supply the adrenal gland. Coming right off the aorta is also the middle suprarenal artery, and then coming off of the renal arteries are the inferior suprarenal arteries. So all three of those supply the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland is drained by suprarenal veins. Now, on the left suprarenal vein drains into the left renal vein, which goes directly into the, So the left suprarenal vein drains into the renal vein and sometimes drains into the inferior phrenic vein as well. And so the renal veins drain into the IVC. Now, the right kidney is a bit different. The right adrenal gland is a bit different because the right adrenal gland drains through the right suprarenal vein directly into the IVC. Okay, so now the capillaries. So now let's take a look at it a little closer. We're going to take a section of that and blow it up. And there we've got our adrenal suprarenal capsule, and then there's the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. Those three things make the adrenal cortex, and then there's the adrenal medulla. Now, if we look on top, take a look. There's an adrenal arterial blood supply that comes in, and then there's our adrenal capillaries that drain down into the adrenal venule. So the zona glomerulosa produces primarily aldosterone, zona fasciculata primarily cortisol, reticularis androgens, and medulla epinephrine. Now watch what happens then is they secrete their hormones into these vessels, and shing, they go all the way down to these venules and then out to the direction of the blood flow and wherever the blood takes them, and affecting their target tissues. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the histology of the adrenal gland is as follows. There is the adrenal capsule. Then there is showing the adrenal cortex with its three areas, the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Those three different areas, and you can see the different staining within there. And then right in the middle is the adrenal medulla. Now we zoom in, we see it and see it. So we just zoom in and you can see all of those different four regions that we care about. Okay, next we're now going to talk about the hormones secreted by the adrenal cortex. And so there we've got the cortex. So there's the zona glomerulosa secretes aldosterone, fasciculata primarily cortisol, and reticularis primarily androgens. Now, something to help keep in mind with this is that aldosterone is a mineral corticoid, so it deals with salt. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, so it deals with sugar, and androgens deal with the sex hormones. So salt, sugar, sex is one way to kind of remember these three hormones. So let's go through them individually now. Let's focus on hormones from the zona glomerulosa, which is primarily aldosterone. Now, aldosterone secreted by the zona glomerulosa, shown there. Now, aldosterone is part of a group called mineralocorticoids. That's technically what the zona glomerulosa secretes, but the main one is aldosterone, and it deals with sodium or salt. Now, it's a steroid hormone, which means it acts intracellularly. So aldosterone stimulation function inhibition is going to take this really cool but a little complicated pathway. So there's the liver, there's our kidney, there's the lungs, and through the lungs is the pulmonary capillary, and then there's the adrenal cortex focusing on the zona glomerulosa. The liver produces a molecule that is called angiotensinogen, which just flows throughout the blood. Now, angiotensinogen is primarily inert until acted upon by an enzyme. Now, this enzyme that is going to be secreted by the kidneys is primarily secreted when blood volume and pressure drop and sodium levels drop sensed by the kidneys, which then secrete renin. Renin is an enzyme that goes and cleaves angiotensinogen to create angiotensin 1, which is now flowing throughout the blood. And when angiotensin 1 flows into the pulmonary capillary, it experiences an enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 has a number of really cool properties. It targets a number of different tissues that deal primarily with blood pressure and blood volume. One of the things that angiotensin 2 targets is the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex in the house that Jack built. The zona glomerulosa secretes aldosterone. Now, aldosterone is a steroid hormone that targets the nephrons in the kidney, primarily the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts. And aldosterone causes these tubules to increase tubular reabsorption of sodium and chloride, and wherever sodium goes, water follows. So when sodium is reabsorbed from the filtrate into the bloodstream, water follows. So we increase water retention, thus increasing blood pressure and blood volume. It helps with secreting potassium into the filtrate, which is then excreted. And therefore, aldosterone helps to decrease plasma potassium. It also helps with stimulating the nephron to secrete protons, which helps to regulate pH. So aldosterone is part of the RAS system, which stands for renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So we're just dealing with the aldosterone part of this. Now, another way the zona glomerulosa secretes aldosterone is that ACTH from the pituitary or an increase of potassium in the blood plasma also stimulate zona glomerulosa to secrete aldosterone. Now, next we're going to talk about the zona fasciculata and talk about cortisol. The cortisol secreted by the zona fasciculata here in this histology. And this is a glucocorticoid, gluco meaning sugar. It helps to regulate sugar in a number of things. But another way to think of this is the stress hormone. So it is a steroid hormone, so it acts intracellularly. Here we're going to talk about the stimulation function and inhibition of cortisol. Well, the hypothalamus is, so what happens for the hypothalamus to start this process is you either go through a stress response or it's part of the regular circadian rhythm. We'll talk about in a few minutes. So let's say that you have a stressful situation that comes. The hypothalamus then secretes this hormone, CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, which targets cells in the anterior pituitary, which produce and secrete a hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And it targets the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona fasciculata, which then produces this mineralocorticoid called glucocorticoid called cortisol, which then flows to the blood by binding to this corticosteroid binding globulin. And then it affects a number of different tissues. We use this abbreviation, a big fib. Hold that thought for a minute. So cortisol then, as it increases in blood, will then have a negative feedback to the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus to stop secreting CRH and ACTH to bring cortisol levels back. So cortisol affects tissues in the body that increase appetite. It also increases blood pressure, increases insulin resistance, and increases gluconeogenesis. It also decreases fibroblast activity and thus decreases wound healing. It decreases or suppresses the immune system in the inflammatory system, and it also decreases bone formation. So therefore, a big fig represents a mnemonic for helping remember what happens in the effector tissues for cortisol is secreted. Now, if you have too much cortisol, like a hypersecretion of cortisol, one of the things results is Cushing syndrome, a prolonged exposure to increased levels of cortisol. And so let's take a look at each one of these in Cushing syndrome symptoms. They have a lot of weight gain because a hypersecretion of cortisol increases appetite, increase of blood pressure, the sense mechanisms that cause newly and elevated high blood pressure. It also creates a process of gluconeogenesis and lipolysis to put a lot of glucose into the bloodstream, and that's going to result in insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. Fibroblast activity is reduced and suppresses immune system and inflammatory system. And as a result, you have slow healing of cuts and your skin becomes more fragile. And then it decreases bone formation, and bones become increased risk of fractures because one of the things cortisol does is reduces the absorption of calcium in your digestive system. Okay, now there's other things that are involved with this. This is just a short synopsis to show if you have a hypersecretion of cortisol. Now, cortisol, let's talk about the circadian rhythm for a minute and why it changes in the amounts it's secreted. So here's a graph with the x-axis represent times of day and the y-axis showing concentrations of cortisol in the blood. So what happens at earlier in the morning, mid-morning, you're all med students and college students, so this is like you're already in class a long time by 9 a.m. So watch what happens as the day progresses is that cortisol levels drop and then it increases again all throughout the night. And so the circadian rhythm of cortisol levels in the blood with optimal or higher levels usually being during those morning hours of 8 to 9-ish in the morning. But another thing to cause a hypersecretion of cortisol is chronic stress. All right, so now let's talk about the zona reticularis. And we're just going to spend a short time on this one. The androgens are secreted by the zona reticularis, shown here in this picture. And these are gonadotropic, gonado for gonads, or the primary sex organs, the testes and the ovaries. And these are sex hormones. And so they're also steroid hormones. Now, the stimulation of this is that the hypothalamus secretes CRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, which then targets the zona reticularis that makes these weak androgens. Now, they go to effector tissues that deal with where sex hormones go, and it has a negative feedback loop like other adrenal hormones to the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. Now, the regulatory control and even the function of adrenal sex hormones is not really fully understood, which is why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. Okay, next we're going to talk about the hormones in the medulla. And the medulla secretes epinephrine. Okay, the medulla. So, epinephrine is secreted by the medulla of the adrenal gland, and these inside the medulla are these cells called chromaffin cells. Now, chromaffin cells are derived from neural crest cells. So the adrenal cortex is embryologically derived from mesoderm, but the adrenal medulla is derived from neural crest cells. So if you remember in neurulation, this process where when the neural fold happens in the neural groove and you finally get the neural tube, you've got these neural crest cells that do a ton of things in the body, one of which form every ganglion, peripheral nervous ganglion in the body, which includes the adrenal medulla. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so the adrenal medulla secretes catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, the three major ones we talk about. But the major catecholamine that the adrenal medulla produces and secretes is epinephrine. And another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. This is the fight or flight response. And epinephrine or adrenaline is a peptide hormone. We're going to take a bit of a detour for a second. All right, so here we've got sympathetic pathways. And for a sympathetic pathway, you always have two neurons. You have a preganglionic sympathetic neuron and a postganglionic sympathetic neuron right here. So if you have pre and postganglionic, there must be a ganglion. So let's go and zoom in on this for a second, okay? So then what happens is the preganglionic sympathetic neuron secretes acetylcholine, which then is going to bind to a nicotinic cholinergic receptor on the postganglionic sympathetic neuron, like this. Shing! And then what happens is, once that binds, it opens up these voltage-gated channels, and then it causes this impulse to continually conduct down that postganglionic sympathetic neuron. Now, why am I talking about this? Now, let's go back and take a look at our adrenal medulla. And so there's our adrenal medulla, and we're going to zoom in on that for a little bit. Now watch. In the preganglionic sympathetic neuron, it's going to secrete acetylcholine, which binds to a nicotinic receptor, a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, to initiate this pathway. That adrenal medulla, where the chromaffin cells are, is this in the sympathetic pathway. The only difference is there's no axon. That cell body of a postganglionic sympathetic neuron is actually the adrenal medulla cells, or the chromaffin cells. So chromaffin cells are really a postganglionic sympathetic neuron group cell bodies. It's a ganglion. And it was, instead of then sending an impulse and you just have a release of a catecholamine at a synapse, it secretes it into the blood. So epinephrine then is secreted into the bloodstream, and then it flows all throughout the bloodstream until it finally hits some effector tissue where it binds to an adrenergic receptor. And as a result, it increases heart rate and ventricular contractility. It increases blood pressure, causes bronchodilation, pupil dilation, and so forth, the things that you have in a fight or flight response. And so there is that neuron I want to focus on for a second. That one, except we're going to put it in a different way. There's the neuron again, where you see it now is the axon flowing from the T12 spinal cord level. And it's a preganglionic sympathetic cell body. You see the cell body in the lateral horn. And notice that this axon comes out the sympathetic ganglion through a splanchnic nerve, specifically the least splanchnic nerve. Now watch as the axon goes by the aortical renal ganglion, it does not synapse, because the synapse happens there between the pre and post ganglionic sympathetic neuron, which is actually the adrenal medulla cells, or chromaffin cells, which then secrete norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And as we talked about before, they go and they bind to and stimulate adrenergic receptors on an effector organ. Now, the adrenal medulla stops secreting epinephrine when the least splanchnic nerve stops innervating it. Let's do this for a second. Let's zoom in. I just want to do this. So there in blue is epinephrine. Epinephrine. Epi upon nephros, the kidney. So they call this hormone the hormone that comes from above the kidney. But they also call it adrenaline, the hormone that comes from the gland on top of the kidney. So epinephrine or adrenaline are the same things. Now we call this receptor the adrenergic receptor, a receptor that binds adrenaline. So for some reason in the United States, we stick with the Greek word, adrenaline. And we stick with the Latin-based receptor, an adrenergic receptor. In Europe, they stick and they call it adrenaline and the adrenergic receptor, but we don't. And I just mention this because it's sometimes easy to mix up this jargon. And that, my friends, is the adrenal gland in a nutshell.
Let's learn about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone is secreted by small masses of tissue located on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, called the parathyroids. Both hormones work to control blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels, while calcitonin decreases blood calcium. Parathyroid works by stimulating bone cells called osteoclasts. These cells move calcium from the bones to the blood. Parathyroid hormone also increases calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules, and it increases calcium absorption in the intestine by facilitating vitamin D production. Vitamin D is needed for calcium absorption. Calcitonin stimulates bone cells called osteoblasts. These cells move calcium from blood to bones. Calcitonin also inhibits calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, and it inhibits calcium absorption by the intestine. Both parathyroid hormone and calcitonin work to regulate blood calcium levels. We hope you've learned something about calcitonin and PTH, and see you next time.
When food is ingested, it travels along the digestive tract, where it is broken down into its component nutrients in order to be absorbed into the bloodstream. One such nutrient is glucose, a simple sugar. Glucose gets absorbed by the stomach and intestines and then enters the bloodstream. It travels through the circulation to all body cells. Once absorbed into the bloodstream, glucose circulates, causing the blood sugar level to rise. An increased level of blood sugar sends a signal to the pancreatic beta cells, which respond by secreting the hormone insulin into the circulation. Insulin is necessary for glucose to reach and be used by several important target tissues throughout the body. These include the liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. Insulin is necessary to keep blood glucose levels stable in the body. Glucose enters the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion.
Thyroid hormones, function and feedback. When the neurosecretory neurons of the hypothalamus secrete thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, this TRH travels down to the axon terminal of the neurons, where it is released to enter the hypophyseal portal system of the brain. This hypophyseal portal system is essentially a bridge between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, particularly the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, passing through its network of capillaries to reach the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. In the anterior pituitary, the TRH binds to receptors on the endocrine cells within the anterior pituitary, stimulating the endocrine cells to secrete thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. The TSH eventually enters the systemic circulation, ultimately reaching the cells of thyroid gland. In the thyroid gland, the TSH binds to receptors within the gland, thereby secreting the thyroid hormones triiodothyronine, or T3, and thyroxine, or T4. The difference between the T3 and T4 hormones of the thyroid gland are as follows. 1. T3 has 3 iodide molecules in its structure, while T4 has 4. 2. Although T3 is less prevalent in the body than T4, it exerts a much stronger effect on the body than the latter. When T4 enters the systemic circulation, it gets converted to T3, which exerts the following effects in the tissues. 1. It increases the number of mitochondria within cells. 2. It controls the rate of cellular respiration, or in other words, controls the metabolic rate of the cells. It accomplishes this by increasing the activity of sodium-potassium ATPase pump, thereby increasing the hydrolysis of all available ATP, resulting in an increase in the basal metabolic rate, or BMR, as well as generating heat as a byproduct of this process. All this creates a need for more ATP, which is mobilized through the energy stores of the liver and skeletal muscles through glycogenolysis, the adipose tissue through lipolysis, and the breakdown of skeletal muscles to amino acids through proteinolysis, thereby providing substrates for cellular respiration. Thus, thyroid hormones contribute to 1. The growth and development of the body's tissue. 2. Creates a balance between the catabolic and anabolic reactions of the body. Increased T3 and T4 levels in the blood results in the hormones binding to receptors in the hypothalamus, thereby blocking the release of TRH or inhibiting the responsiveness of the anterior pituitary to TRH, thus creating a negative feedback which inhibits the rising levels of the thyroid hormones in the blood.